companies over the last few decades, if we look at a stat like engagement, right, or a metric like engagement, it's historically terrible, right? Like, so ever since Gallup has started measuring it, it's mostly been 2/3 of people are kind of meh about work or worse. And so we've not actually done a very good job of creating institutional places for people to where they're going to spend the majority of their waking adult lives doing things. They've historically not been very motivational or inspirational. Just imagine what we could accomplish if we created institutions that were inspirational to the people who work there.
Josh, welcome to the Future Work Podcast. I'm really excited to have you here. I mean, gosh, you've worked with some of the biggest brands in the world. So, right off, I'm going to ask you, what pattern have you seen companies that truly engage with their employees are using versus those that are stuck in the old model of work?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me, Frank. It's really lovely to be here. And something that I see consistently is that the organizations who really care about people, uh, their leaders are consistently trying to maximize for the energy of the people that work there. So they're trying to, because there's a whole lot of things inside the work, the way we work today, that suck the energy out of people. But the best leaders try their best to remove those obstacles, to create better systems that don't suck the life out of people. Um, so they create better processes around everything as much as
What,
they possibly can.
what would be? Can you give us some examples of what some of those things might be? I mean, right now in this country, in the United States, we've got so many political changes going on that are impacting a
Mm.
lot of business changes and shareholders versus boards on a variety of issues.
Yeah.
What are some examples of companies that are really energizing and seeing the benefit of it? It's one thing to say, "We got a great energy going here." Yeah, really? What's your year end look like? Prove it. Prove that the energy has an ROI. And are you seeing that, or is it really seen other places like longer retention, better recruiting? Where are you seeing this energy come through?
Yeah. I think we see this in the study of just kind of like the work of human expansion inside organizations for the last 20 years, right? So my perspective on this is that there's plenty of really good examples, and we can go all the way back to books like Firms of Endearment, right? So if people want a list of organizations that work this way and the ROI attached to it, you can go find that research. It's not very hard to find. It's been out for a really long time. My larger concern these days is, why aren't more companies doing this, right? So why aren't more organizations actually, since we know definitively at this point that helping humans be better at work creates better work outcomes. And
Yes.
you just have to look at it over a long enough time horizon. So this is where it becomes a little bit challenging, is that, and I think maybe one of the foundational kind of um, core problems is that business is managed in a short-term framework, right? We're looking, especially publicly,
Quarter to
traded
quarter,
companies.
year to year,
It is.
day to day.
Yep. Yep. And if the senior leaders don't kind of adhere to those metrics, they lose their jobs. And so the problem is that we've got this kind of like quarterly, or daily, to your point, structure of like how we're measuring the success of our organizations. But humans are inherently a long-term investment, right? We have 30 to 40-year long careers. So what we find is we find this kind of tension between leaders who really want to do the right thing and they want to do the work of human expansion inside their companies, but they're constantly kind of being torn by the fiduciary rules that they also feel obligated to uphold.
Mhm.
So this becomes the larger challenge from my perspective. So we can find tons of examples of companies who do this, right? We can look at Gallup engagement data for the last, I don't know, probably almost going on 3 decades now, right? There really isn't any question, at least in my mind, that the work of human expansion is good for company outputs. You just have to look at it in a long enough time horizon for it to make sense.
Well, a lot of if this data is available, which I
Yeah.
have seen it, and I believe you're
Yeah.
absolutely correct. By the way, I've had a 55-year career, so I'm really going for it.
Yes,
So
exactly.
I'm either subhuman or ultra human. I don't know what. But the assuming the data is all correct and everything, and everybody can see this
Mm.
obvious characteristic and benefit as you're defining it, and we can look at companies and leaders that have proven it through time. Why isn't it more of a norm? Why do companies still think prioritizing employee well-being comes at the expense of productivity and profits? Why are they stuck there? If everybody knows, the shareholders should know it too, and not all shareholders are day traders. There's most
Yeah.
institutional shareholders are looking for a stable, ongoing, continued growth
Mm.
cycle that they can count on, and they'd rather have something they can count on than something that's explosive and all over the place.
Yeah. So I think what we're seeing here is something that Deming, so one of the great kind of systems
Sure.
thinkers of the last century, one of his great quotes is that a bad system will beat a good person every time. And so I think in order to get to the answer of what you're asking, Frank, we've got to look, it's a system level problem. We've got a system here that's dictating these kind of short term thinking cycles and short term action cycles. And until the system is reformed, is until the system is actually kind of reimagined, then we will forever kind of be stuck in this short-term thinking cycle that we're in now. And that leads to all sorts of all sorts of problems down the road. Right? Because to your point, we want to think more long term, right? I think many people do want longer term investments. They want companies that'll stick around. But we're stuck in this system that demands short term returns.
So I'm going to lay blame on this in your words, by the way, in your name. What you're saying really is that the investors are responsible for the challenges that companies have in putting long term plans together. And if the investors, the system of raising capital or capital support, isn't aligned with the companies who want to align with their employees, who want to take this forward, then the system will always fail. But aren't there always renegades to the system,
Hmm.
no matter what?
Yeah.
People that everybody's going left, I'm going to go right. I think
Yeah.
we've seen a lot of our most successful industry leaders, leaders of various industries, take contrarian positions and prove that they're the path as opposed to the other.
Yeah, I think from like a business entrepreneurial perspective, that's true. But I don't really see anyone challenging the status quo of this dominant worldview that all right, this is like a 50-year-old kind of economics perspective of that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder return. Right. So we're kind of living on the back of that philosophy.
Mhm.
And I don't really see anyone challenging that. Like that's not true. There are kind of outliers coming in, but like in terms of the dominant um, system, right? We're still all playing that game by and large, and I think that's the problem.
Well, what would you replace it with? What would you replace it with? What would you stand on the street corner and say, "We should no longer do this. Instead, if we do my idea, that everything's gonna work out."
Yeah, I think this is the kind of the question maybe of the next decade plus is how do we transition from this current ideology, which the only outcome of this path is really something like annihilation, right? We like, I know that sounds really dramatic, but it really
Annihilation?
I did, and I think this is really true because we are on a path of trying to kind of extract unending growth patterns from a planet of finite resources. Right? Like this equation doesn't balance. And so the logical path that we are on now leads to a place that none of us want. And so we have to reinvent, and we have to reinvent at the system level. And so one of the ways that I think about, to your question, what do we replace it with? Uh, I think there's a whole lot of things we're going to need to replace. But in terms of a philosophy, right, I think what we need to replace is we need a different kind of organizing story. So right now, the organizing story of life is largely business, right? So what kind of organizes our days, by and large, is this thing called work or business, right? It determines how much extra money you have to spend. It determines largely where you live, maybe less and less so, but for many occupations, still determines where you live. If you're in the country like the US, it determines whether you have health care, right? So business and work is the organizing story of life. And the challenge is that the way business is currently structured, it's a profit at all costs model. And so that's where we run into these kind of really existential problems. So when we start to look into the future, we say this is not tenable. This is not going to work over the long term. And so we need a new organizing story that's not profit centric, first of all. So if we're going to replace something, that's one thing we need to do. So we need a different kind of target,
Well,
first of
but
all, right? Yeah,
can,
go
can,
ahead.
is that when we talk about this, a lot of times we take a very US centric view.
Hmm.
Um, and in order to function, as you're saying, you can't have a new US order, in my opinion. And I'm going to get real weird here for a second. So you actually need a total new world order,
Hmm.
because as long as one national economy is competing against another national economy in the same way that corporations try and get more market share or try and get better product or whatever. It's the same competition. Call all the countries in the world, each of the countries in the world, each corporate members, and they're all
Right.
trying to do the same thing as companies do.
Yeah.
Unless you can do it that way, the national interest demand, from whatever perspective you have, that you produce
Mhm.
and that you produce competitively against other national interests. That's a big thing dominating the headlines
Mhm.
today, overall, and whether it's dominating on, loudly or whether it's sub rosa, doesn't matter. It's still there. So how do you do it? And I know you say that the future of work is deliberate and people have to intentionally design new spaces and workplaces, which I totally agree with you on. Um, but how do you rectify that on a global basis,
Yeah.
especially as we have a global population growth? If we
Yeah.
had zero population growth, everything would be easier. We could take our finite resources and manage them more effectively. But if you have global population growth, or growth in some areas globally and not in others, especially,
Right.
how do you rectify that challenge?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting example too, because I think at least some of the demographers that I follow will say that we have some big challenges demographically in certain places like China, um,
And Africa,
and where it's population.
the most resources, but the least ability to benefit from them.
Well, in places like China, where we potentially have really really kind of striking population decline going
Yeah,
on, over the next 10 years or so. And so I think to your point though, that only becomes really problematic if we are looking through the lens of nation states, right? So as we look through this lens of competition and nation states, then that's really problematic because we have potential collapse of certain nations, and we have potential booms in other nations. We have no really good way of flattening this out or kind of like serving the larger population
that is
of
my
of
point.
humanity. Yeah, exactly. So I think where this does go is it does lead. us to a place. And this is what humans are really good at, right? This is kind of why we're still around and why we're as successful as we are on the planet, is because of cooperation. I think there's a different there's a different possibility for us as a human species to relearn how to cooperate in a global way. And we've done these things before. Historically, we've learned how to cooperate in global ways. I think we're just in a particular cycle of history right now, which is making that feel like it's really hard. It's making it feel like this is a real, like we can't imagine something like the UN, right? Kind of like, but I think it's coming back around. I think what's going to happen is this period of nationalism is going to release the new possibility of a new globalism, of a new global citizenry that we can't really like even picture today what that would feel like and will feel like. Um, but I think it's coming.
You just said a moment ago that we need to obliterate the old system.
I think the old system's going to obliterate us if we don't change it.
Yeah, well, but by the way, I thought we were superior because we had opposable thumbs, but
Also helpful.
um, but um, do we need to break the system forcefully
Hmm.
in order to remake it? And if we do, in whose image do we remake it? Who really has a successful enough example that could take, say, look at us, we're doing it right, and they've got the resources and the capacity to, I don't want to say impose it, but to lead where others would say, yeah, you're right. We want that. Who has that in such a
Yeah.
manner that we could gain that type of cooperation that you're talking about? And I know we're on topic, but we're off topic. I know that, but it's an interesting place to go because if you're going to solve problems at the bottom, you do have to solve them at the top
Hmm.
also.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was saying, right, we do need a new organizing story, right? We need something that's different than profit at all costs. So the kind of story I think we need is one that's more cooperative. It's more about maybe the point of all of this isn't just making money. Maybe the point of this is more of like a Star Trek kind of thing. It's about exploration. Or maybe it's a different thing. Maybe it's about learning. Maybe it's about, there's all sorts of other ideas and ideologies we could actually like orbit our lives around that don't involve this kind of like money centric approach. So I think that's going to be important for humanity to contend with in the next couple decades. But in terms of your other question about like what models are there, I think we can actually go to some of the more self-organizing structures, organizational structures in the world, and I think there's some really good examples there for that we can look to.
What would those be? A couple of them. Hang
Yeah,
on.
so there's a number throughout the world, and I'll give all the listeners here a website to go if you want to really get into this. Uh, the best website I found is there's a group called Corporate Rebels, and they're based in Europe, and they've just done this extraordinary kind of global search for organizations that are really thinking differently about organizational structures. And so they've cataloged these folks and they've interviewed them. And so it's just they can tell you way more stories about these companies than I can in our short time today. But
That's
there's,
corporaterebels.com.
yeah, corporate-rebels.com, I think. But yeah, there's some big ones. Yeah, there's some really, really big companies. These are not just small companies, right? They're really, really large ones. Some companies like Bertsorg, companies like Hire in China,
Uh-huh.
they're really self-managing, self-organizing structures that are inherently more humanistic at their core. Uh, I think we can use some of those organizing principles actually as we look at new forms of governance that are more cooperative across the planet.
No, that's interesting. It kind of takes us back to the leaders worrying about prioritizing the wellness of the employees
Yeah.
or the teams at the expense of profit
Yeah.
overall. And yet, profit is required to raise capital, and capital is required to be competitive,
Yeah.
et cetera. So, I always think, and this is my personal life's view, I guess, that we all have an inherent responsibility to be productive until we're no longer able to be. And I don't equate productivity myself with profit after you have enough.
Right.
And I don't know what enough is. It's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I look at several large entrepreneurial individuals, particularly a few of them around the tech industry, that say, well, I have enough, and now I'm going to start contributing it back to
Mhm.
humanity or back to charities,
Yeah.
charitable giving, et cetera, which had a really rough time in 2024, by the way, overall. But once you have enough, then you should for yourself, then you should work for others. Uh,
Mm.
um, uh, this all kind of brings us to prioritizing well-being and
Mhm.
bold statements and reorganizing structures. We just went through the pandemic. We all know
Mhm.
it. Um, Almost all companies self-organized or self-reorganized to work remotely.
Mm.
Okay, to
Yeah.
the health benefit at the time of their employees, and then to the work-life balance benefit as it drug on a little bit to the employees. And now a great number of very loud and very powerful companies are saying, no, get your ass back to the office.
I know.
Okay. Why? Well,
Yeah.
one of the big finance fellows over at JP Morgan says, well, we have to all be in the office to preserve our corporate culture.
Yeah.
Really? Do you even have a culture then? I question that.
Yeah.
And others say, no, we have to do it because we can't manage our creativity. You were creative during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Um, so, how does work life balance and how does remote work versus back to the office, how do these dictates that say you have to do this or you have to do that, are those really working or is that all going to break apart? Is that breaking apart of that? Is that going to be part of this new order that you're talking about?
I think it's probably contributing to the breakdown. Yeah, because what we're seeing there is a strong lapse of judgment from leadership and a really like on the not.
Oh, the lack of leadership.
Yeah. It's not well thought through because of what you just mentioned, right? Like everyone can kind of see through this, right? And say, "Oh, well, we just did this in the pandemic." Like, and now you're saying we can't? Like, we know that's not like it doesn't it doesn't line up in people's minds. And the thing about flexibility is once you have it, it's like toothpaste going back in the tube.
Freedom, baby. You can't put the genie back in the bottle here.
You just can't, right? So and yeah, so this is it really is a lapse in judgment, and I do think it's gonna cause further cracks in the foundations of our systems and in our faith in institutions and leaders at the senior level. And um, the best way I've found to think about this is that the office should be viewed as a tool. So just like any other tool you use to do your job, some people need different tools. Some people don't actually need an office at all.
Sure.
Some people might, right? If they need to like get together in the same space because they're building some kind of hardware or what. Right? There are some jobs that need the tool of an office. But some jobs do not. Some jobs need it more frequently, and some jobs don't need it at all. Right? So a much better way to think about the office I found is think about it like a tool. And is it a tool that you need? And when do you need it? And how much do you need it? And then the other thing about that's really like failing in this whole conversation is that there's a there's kind of a lack of trust implied in these decisions where it's like, okay, if the office is actually a tool, and so, supposedly I've hired you to come do a job and you're an expert and that's why I've hired you. And you should actually know how to use your tools because you're an adult with a fully formed adult with a fully formed brain in your head that I've hired for your expertise. And you got those thumbs, right? It's going to be great. And then but then in the other breath, I'm saying that I don't trust you to know how to use your tools because you got to get your ass back in the office. Right. And this kind of dissonance it's not going to hold.
I think it does come down to that one word of trust.
Yeah.
And proof. If I'm going to ask you to trust me every day, then every day I owe you the proof of my worthiness. um, overall, and that is hard for companies,
Mm,
particularly hard for companies that are multinational and multicultural as a result of that. Technology business doesn't know anything about boundaries,
mm,
borders anymore. Borders are national things, countrywide. They have nothing to do with business anymore,
yeah,
um, overall. And I wonder, where it really leads. All revolutions that have been successful are founded on seeking freedom.
mm,
So if freedom is what people are seeking in business or in the control of their own life, well, Randstad, the biggest HR recruiting company in the world, on behalf of the global Fortune 1000 generally, they get a 5-to-1 return of resumes, of CVs, if the words remote or opportunity to work remote are in the job description.
yeah,
5 times as many people. So, I think the challenge now, and I think, Tim Ferriss actually said this the other day, that companies that don't allow for freedom will find themselves losing talent and ultimately will lose not just the war for talent, the battle for talent, but the war corporately. And
mm,
economies that have very high taxes. Portugal just completely redid their tax structure to allow for people, I believe it's under 35, to have that were within a certain revenue income level,
mm,
to have a reduced tax structure until they establish themselves. Well, the
mm,
problem is the wage levels in Portugal are lower anyway, so they can't keep talent in the country even.
mm,
So countries have to compete for this, not just for profitability of their economic system, but to keep the people within their economic system now, if they don't allow to consider the work-life balance or the value that people are able to create. So how it's I think it takes it all back around to energy, keeping the
mm,
energy in the companies,
yeah,
not just the time that people contribute, but that energy that you were talking about really is the true currency,
yeah,
desire to produce.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's the place where we're kind of losing people the most, right? We're really overall, right? We and in companies over the last few decades, right? If we look at a stat like engagement, right, or a metric like engagement, it's historically terrible, right? Like, so ever since Gallup has started measuring it, it's mostly been 2/3 of people are kind of meh about work or worse.
Yeah,
And so, like, we've not actually done a very good job of creating institutional places for people to where they're going to spend the majority of their waking adult lives doing things. They've historically not been very motivational or inspirational. And just imagine what we could accomplish if we created institutions that were inspirational to the people who work there.
it's funny. Within the context of this conversation, you and I have each used the term work 50 times, a whole bunch of times. Not once have either one of us used the term career.
Hmm.
And I think that when we talk negatively, we talk about work. When we talk positively, we talk about career. We've been hitting a lot of negatives here, things that need to change overall. But if you look at your daily activities, I was going to say grind, and then I went into, but your daily activities as work, as opposed to
Hmm.
something that gives you joy in
Yeah.
because of what you're able to produce, like an artist might have or a craftsperson
Yeah.
might have to create something with that had lasting value, um, then you're probably not going to be happy no matter who you work for.
Hmm.
That you have to find that part of what you do yourself, and then find the right place to practice it. And I think too many people, this is my own view, and you could argue it certainly, don't spend enough time in their younger years figuring out what they want to do. And they just automatically get into a job, and
Mm.
then a job becomes a cage, and then a cage becomes a place to gripe about where the job they're in. But they didn't really think about who do I really want to be? Who do I want to be? And unless people are, I don't want to say taught to do that, but unless that concept comes along with people, then I don't think whatever structure you create is going to create an equal level of satisfaction.
It's one of the reasons why I've really latched on to this philosophy of human energy over the last 10 plus years. I just like there's something about looking through this lens of saying, does this work inherently bring me energy? Like, do I feel energized when I do it? This becomes a
Exactly.
very, very visceral thing that I can learn how to feel. Like most of us, when it comes to work, I think have been trained to kind of ignore that, right? We power through, we push harder, right? Like that's kind of the language of work instead of saying, does this make me come alive? And does this align with who I'm wired to be? Most of us can have a list a mile long, all the crap that drains us at work. Most of us don't have a clue. We couldn't even come up with a top three when it comes to what energizes us about work. And this is inherently part of the problem is we're not trained. We're not taught. We're not even, this is not modeled. It's kind of nowhere in the conversation yet is to say, what are the things that are inherently energizing for me? And how do I do more of that throughout my work day? And organizations can actually be really powerful tools to create the environments to help people make those discoveries. And
Mhm.
that's where I've personally seen in my work the real magic happen. Whereas when you combine this organization and leadership to say, we're going to create an environment here that helps people discover what brings them energy. And when you do it that way and you come at it from both sides, that's when you really unleash the magic of people working towards a cause.
Josh, I've kind of taken you down a path here. And I know that of determining what really works versus what doesn't, especially for the individual, is critically important.
Mhm.
Is there an individual assessment process that you can leave us with that will help each person listening today to get to have the guidance on how they can determine their own satisfaction level, and maybe if they're unsatisfied, do something about it?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah. So we do use a scientific assessment in my work. And so that's available. If anyone's curious about that, just reach out to me. But then you can also do this absolutely for free because you have a built-in energy detector, which is your body. And so, like we were just saying, right? Like we've learned how to ignore the fact that we're drained all day at work, and we just keep going.
Right.
And so the opportunity here is to not do that and actually pay attention to what your body tells you when you're doing certain activities throughout your day. And so the simple thing here, if you don't want to get into the scientific assessment and all that stuff, or you don't have the budget to do it, right? Like you can do this yourself. Just take a piece of paper, draw a vertical line down the center. On one side, write energizing, and on the other side, write draining. And we call this an energy journal. And you just keep track. So over the course of, I would say 2 weeks, really like take this paper with you and make notes throughout your workday. And on the end, right, and over the 2 weeks, you'll find that there are certain activities that show up on the energizing side, and there's going to be other activities that show up on the draining side. And the goal after that is pretty simple, but it's not easy. What you want to do is you want to do more of what energizes you and less of what doesn't. All right. This is simple, but it's not always easy to do.
Well, simple is hard for
Yeah.
a lot of us because
Often.
I think, you were talking about human beings be cooperative. Human beings
Yeah.
also complicate stuff unnecessarily,
Yeah. Yeah.
overall. But in thinking about what you just said, I was, thinking of myself, and I was thinking, what energizes me personally, and maybe this is typical, um, is when I'm able to contribute something to others that advances a goal
Hmm.
where everybody says, "Oh yeah, good idea," or hadn't thought of it that way," or something of that nature. And what drains me um, is going into a meeting where nobody has any ideas. They're just there for the 30 minutes to move
Yeah.
on to the next damn meeting.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what drains me.
For sure.
No one has thought about what they're going to do to
Yeah.
progress whatever topic you're working on.
Right.
And whether I make the contribution or someone else makes a really good contribution, that's what energizes me,
Right. So what I would do if we were working together.
is
Oh,
what
I'm
drains.
sorry.
I say non-productivity is what drains me.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would do if we're working together on this, Frank, is I would actually push you to go deeper on that, because I think you're right. There probably is some commonality to say, like, I like to contribute to something that matters, right? Like that's
Exactly.
true. And like, what's underneath it? So in our work, what we're really pushing people to do is to build their energy intelligence, to really start to understand it at a deep fundamental level, uh, kind of the granular things that are underneath that. So, because there's a whole lot of things that could be motivating your desire to contribute, right? So, is it actually the ideas themselves that you just love the world of ideas, or is it the people you're collaborating with, or is it, you know, the details, or is it the like getting to work on something like an initiative kind of way? Like, so there's all sorts of like kind of activities underneath. I think what you just said, where we would encourage people to go deeper and say, get to those really granular things underneath, because then that's when you find your consistent source of renewable energy for you, right? And if you can say it's the ideas themselves, or it's the strategy of this. I just like, it doesn't matter what environment you put me in. I just love strategy, right? So when you can get to that level, then it becomes really cross applicable.
Well, no, I think you're right, and boy, what a confusing but great place to live to leave the conversation today, because it causes each of us to think about ourselves a little bit, and really how we want to find our self satisfaction within whatever we're doing, as much as the community satisfaction. And one might be very very good, and the other might not be good at all.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm going to take that granular. I'm going to take that challenge. I'm actually going to make a little T chart and write the good and the bad,
Mm,
and think about
nice.
that for the next week. See if I
Yeah.
come out ahead, or how far ahead I come out as a result of that.
Cool. I'll be excited to hear what you learn.
Yeah, I'll share it. Definitely will.
Please
And
do.
thank you very much for your time today. You've been really engaging, and what you're working on is, God, it affects us all globally. And I know that you're doing a lot of work for many good companies. And have you been publishing lately?
Yeah, more and more. So I've been kind of I've been out of the game a little bit in the last few years, because I've been focused on being a CEO for a tech company,
Uh
and
huh.
that just took all my time and energy. And but now that project's done, I'm really excited to be more in the thought leadership space. So I'm publishing pretty regularly on LinkedIn, and then also in my own blog at joshallan.com. And but yeah, so either of those places that people can find what I'm writing. I publish a new article every week.
Well, we would encourage everybody to follow joshallan.com. And Josh, maybe you'd be kind enough at some point to publish with All Work as well.
Oh, I'd be honored. Yeah, let's make that happen.
Okay. Well, thank you much. We'll look forward to meeting next time.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Frank. Appreciate you.
If it's impacting the future of work, it's in the Future of Work podcast by allwork.space.